Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the CIGI campus. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science and the program officer for the global governance programs, which are based here at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Tonight is the inaugural event in this year's 2012-2013 Ambassadors Lecture Series, which is organized by the University of Waterloo and co-sponsored by the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Balsley School of International Affairs, which is a three-way partnership between CIGI, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Waterloo. And this year's theme for the series is the BRIC countries. This evening's topic is Brazil and its prospects for the future, presented by His Excellency, Mr. Piragibe dos Santos Tarragô, Ambassador of Brazil to Canada. And I think it's fair to say that Brazil is a major player on the world stage. In recent years, Brazil has made incredible contributions to the United Nations system. One example, since 2004, Brazil, along with a number of Latin American countries, has been leading the rebuilding effort in Haiti, which is no easy task, including providing much-needed security to the tiny Caribbean country. Brazil has also become a leader in the global economy and on issues of global development. One of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Hochstetter, who's a specialist on Brazil, has noted that, and I quote her, "The trajectory is clearly in the direction of Brazil being an increasingly important contributor to the global common goods." And as I'm sure you all know, Brazil will be hosting the 2014 World Cup of Soccer and the 2016 Summer Olympic Games, and we anticipate both of those events with great eagerness. Finally, many of you may have seen this in the Globe and Mail this morning or heard it on CBC Radio, but Brazil has just today strengthened its ties with Canada. And it was reported that a Brazilian company, JBS South America, is now in fact taking over the management of the now infamous XL Foods processing plant in Alberta. Today we are very lucky to have Ambassador Tarragô join us today. Following his talk, there will be a short question and answer period. There are microphones in each aisle, and I invite you to come up and ask questions, and please introduce yourself when you do ask your question. I will now share with you the ambassador's bio, which is absolutely incredible. His Excellency has been Ambassador of Brazil to Canada since February 2011. He's a career diplomat since 1975, and he has had postings that include Maputo, the United Nations, Ottawa, Geneva, Caracas, and London. At the Ministry of External Affairs in Brazil, he headed the Trade on High Technology Goods Division and Trade Policy Division and the Department of Economic Affairs. He has also served as Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. He has worked mostly in economic matters in his functions in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was the main negotiator for Brazil in the very important NAMA negotiations in the Doha round from 2003 to 2005, and in the TRIPS negotiations in the Uruguay round. He was spokesperson for the producing countries at the International Coffee Organization and was also Brazilian delegate to many negotiations at the United Nations, including those at the General Assembly, those involving Security Council reform, the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission, UNCTAD, the Group of 77, South-South Cooperation, as well as the GATT and the WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. Please help me in welcoming Ambassador Tarragô.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event, CIGI, the Balsley School of International Affairs, Thanks also to Dr. Thompson for the words of introduction, it pronounced to me, in my regard. And also say that I'm very happy to be here in Waterloo. I've been very well received by Waterloo, and I'm on going back to Ottawa. I'm going to tell my French colleague that he could come here without any problem. What I'll present to you today is an overview about Brazil. And you'll see from the overview what Brazil has been doing and what direction is taking. And you can certainly assess what are the possibilities of Brazil in the future. This presentation intends to provide my personal views about Brazil prospects for the coming years. I have tried to make my views as objective as possible, based on facts and data, especially as regards the economic and social fields. I have also made use of information contained in government papers, as they reflect policies whose implementation will influence the direction the country will take in the years to come. And I have taken my consideration 4 elements, namely the political, the economic, social, and foreign policy elements. To start with, I will just give you a data about Brazil, and that you could peruse and, as I speak, and you'll see the main elements that constitute today Brazil as a big country, I mean territorial and population and GDP, the natural resources it has, and the democracy that is following politically, and is a very good neighbor with our friends in Latin America. It is the 6th largest economy today in the world, and the 5th largest area, and the 5th largest population. But to understand the Brazil of today, I think I should give you a brief view of its political evolution. Brazil became independent from Portugal in 1822. In early 1800s, on account of Napoleonic wars in Europe, the King of Portugal fled to Brazil and set out to govern the kingdom from Rio de Janeiro. After the demise of Napoleon, the Portuguese king returned to Lisbon in 1816. However, he left behind his son, Prince Pedro, to run the vice-kingdom of Brazil. In 1822, the prince, rebelling against the reimposition of draconian colonial rules by Lisbon, declared the independence of Brazil and was crowned king. So Brazil became a monarchy for almost 70 years, up to 1889, when the Republic was installed after a military coup. The economic formation of the country derives essentially from the exploration of its natural resources and immigration voluntary or not. In the 1800s, immigration to Brazil grew exponentially. It came mainly from Africa, slaves, but also from Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy. New lands were opened for agricultural production. Coffee and sugar were the principal export items then, and the coffee plantations that spread around São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro produced the wealth necessary to establish the first industrial factories in Brazil. So by the end of the 19th century, and thanks to an open door policy implemented, increasing foreign investment came to Brazil. And it was at that time that the first Canadian investment arrived in Brazil with the Brazil Traction Light and Power Company, a company that made history in Brazil. It brought electricity to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and after that a telephone company too. And up to a certain point in time, they had more than 45,000 employees in Brazil. The company no longer exists. As such, it has been eventually taken over by Brookfield, which is a company that I'm sure you all know. Again, still on the historical aspect of Brazil, slavery was finally abolished in 1888. In the 1900s, now a republic, the country has continued to receive a large inflow of immigrants, but this time also from Japan and the Middle East, especially Syrian Lebanese people. Though a republic, the rural oligarchies continue to hold the reins of the government. A continuous power struggle between the states and the central government characterized a good deal of the century, which led to the outburst of some revolts and civil uprisings. Eventually, in 1964, the civilian government, accused of being too friendly to communism, was deposed by the military, which ruled the country for 21 years up to 1985. In 1960, Brasilia was designated as the new capital of the country. It was built from the scratch in the Central West region, having as a goal to induce the population to occupy the vast hinterland and thus bring development to an area hitherto unproductive. While the economy throughout the century alternated long periods of steady growth with others of stagnation, industrialization was consolidated around São Paulo and southeastern states. Agriculture and cattle raising prospered with the incorporation of new areas of the Central West and the North. Likewise, mining, in particular iron ore, and more recently oil, have taken on greater significance in the Brazilian economy. The economic development has been fast. From the 1930 to 1970, Brazil grew at rates higher than those experienced by China today. But such growth has been highly unequal. Only recently, with the economic stability and social inclusion policies, concrete steps have been taken to reduce the inequality and to lay down the basis for a sustained economic growth, of which I'll talk later in this presentation. So, coming to the 21st century, one might say that Brazil has found at a long last a secure and solid path to grow as a democratic country. It has been a long learning process since the independence in 1822. For nearly 2 centuries, the political institutions, by and large, were fragile, subject to internal and external pressures, and unable to provide a stable direction to the country. There are many reasons for that. Among endogenous reasons, one can mention the late abolition of slavery, the prevalence of rural oligarchies, the excessive reliance on the military to keep political stability, the rapid, somewhat chaotic urbanization, weakened political parties, populist governments, economic instabilities, and mismanagements. Also, some external factors have affected Brazil's ability to consolidate a credible political system. One can cite, for instance, the economic constraints imposed by the European powers in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. The East-West rivalry on the second half of the last century also played a role in that. And also, economic and technological pressures suffered by the country. Though Brazil was able to grapple with many of those factors, some of them are still at play today, I think that the political institutions have gradually matured. In a way, they are now able to provide solutions to the many problems affecting the country's governance without prejudice to the democratic system. The political system is at present better equipped to deal with the instabilities generated either by the domestic factors, such as corruption, for instance, or by external factors. More concretely, the new federal constitution promulgated in 1988 has provided the legal and institutional framework to address the political crises. Its main test was the process of impeachment against President Collor de Mello in 1992 that took place without any danger to internal peace. The uncertainties created by the traumatic change of guard at the top of the government were not used by opportunist politicians to call back the military and instigate a coup, as it often happened in the past. The Brazilian people have displayed political restraint and have seemingly put to rest for good the expediency of running for the army whenever there was a threat to the political order or stability. Another important feature in the political scenery is the emergence of the Workers' Party in the 1980s. The Workers' Party, or PT, as it's known in Portuguese, is originally a grassroots party, essentially urban, anchored on the trade unions and on the left wing of the Catholic Church. The new party was created strongly bent to redress the national political spectrum skewed to cater the interests of the ruling class. Soon it proved to be a viable alternative to the predominance of the traditional parties, most of them patronized by rural oligarchies or conservative industrialists. With the PT and the numerous small parties created in the aftermath of the fall of the dictatorship in the mid-80s, the political forces in Brazil have become more representative of the variety of interests prevailing in the Brazilian society. So Brazil's present political scene is characterized by stability with ample freedom of expression and participation. The successful experience of 6 elections for president, governors, senators, and deputies since the enactment of the new constitution has attested to the high degree of political maturity attained and consolidated the rule of law. So how is today's Brazilian government? President Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party has been in power since January 2011 after being elected with 56% of the almost 100 million votes cast. At present, she enjoys a high approval rate, around 70%. The president is supported by a coalition of 16 parties, which reflects a wide political spectrum, mostly from the center and the left. However, Brazil's political configuration is, by and large, noted less by ideological considerations than by pragmatism and regional or special interests. On balance, in nearly 2 years in office, President Dilma Rousseff's government has achieved relative success. The coalition parties have helped pass important legislation of interest to the government. They continue to enjoy strong popular support, as shown by their performance in the latest municipal elections. The president has succeeded in keeping the coalition united and a firm grip on public affairs, despite having to dismiss a number of ministers suspected of corruption and to face the recent condemnation of former heads of the PT by the Supreme Court accused of having used public money to buy political allegiance in Congress. Given the freedom of press, the government is expected to continue to be in the spotlight and have its decisions and actions scrutinized by the opposition with the help of the media, while it strives to keep united the supporting coalition. In its favor, it has people's support to the programs that aim to increase the efforts to reduce the gross inequalities still existing in the Brazilian society. The government is targeting now the eradication of extreme poverty. The huge income gap is deemed to be at the root of urban insecurity, besides constituting a drain in public services and an obstacle to development. The existence of large pockets of poverty, notably in big urban centers, has been a perennial source of insecurity. A high rate of urban criminality continues to defy Brazil's ability to decrease delinquency. However, major and novel experiences that combine reinforced police action with provision of public services are being put into practice with positive results. Turning now to the economy, the origins of Brazil's most recent cycle of economic growth and prosperity can be traced back to the liberalizing reforms of the 1990s and to the introduction of the Plano Real in 1994, which tamed inflation. I'll show you now some graphics as soon as just to show how the population in Brazil grew over the years since 1900, from 17 million to 191 million now. But the growth rate of the increase of the population is going down from almost 3% in 1965 to less than 1% today. And here is an interesting graphic. It shows, this has been done by the World Bank. It shows that only 3 countries in the world have the unique characteristics of a large population, large territory, and a big GDP. Only United States, Brazil, and China have these 3 characteristics. The others fail to have one of them at least. But on economy, I would say that Brazil's economic fundamentals have especially improved with the adoption, as of 1999, of a floating exchange rate, an inflation targeting system, and primary fiscal surpluses. These have been the 3 pillars of a macroeconomic policy that accounts for the stability enjoyed by the country over the last decade. And President Dilma has made it clear that she will not change those policies. They have only been adapted to allow for some counter-cyclical measures in the face of slower economic growth and of the downturn in the global economy. So here you have a very summarized items of the economic policies followed by the Brazilian government. And as I was saying, the main features of this policy are these 3 pillars: inflation targeting, fiscal responsibility, exchange rate flexibility. And the combination of this with prudential policy and strong bank supervision have resulted in Brazil's improving its capacity to absorb internal and external shocks, acquired macroeconomic and financial stability, and set the basis for a sustainable economic growth, has managed to develop the credit and capital markets, and is enjoying an investment growth. Just to give an idea of how the inflation has been tamed in Brazil, I'll show you here what used to be monthly index of inflation in Brazil. As you can see, in October 88, the monthly index was 82%. 82% a month of inflation. And in 1993 was 48%. Then with the Plano Real in 1994, as you can see, inflation came down almost to zero on a monthly basis. So it was a crucial turning point in the Brazilian economy at that point. And also the net public debt, so as it came down dramatically from almost 60% of GDP in 2002 to around 35% in 2012. This was being achieved thanks to this policy of providing fiscal surplus every year. But now I'll turn to social development. To say that Brazil's economic growth can also be explained by the implementation of policies designed to improve social inclusion. Social policies have led to greater access to education, real increases in the minimum wage, greater access to credit by consumers, universal access to health services, universal coverage of social security benefits, and in addition, the government set in motion ambitious programs of conditional cash transfers, namely the Bolsa Familia and the Brazil Without Extreme Poverty, aiming at those at the bottom of the income pyramid. So, as a result of that, you can see the declining poverty and inequality by these graphics. The blue one shows the extreme poverty, how it has been declining from about 14% of the population in 1981 to around 7% today. And the red line is the Gini index that measures the inequality in a given country. So Brazil has reached almost 62 in 1990, and today is coming down to around 52 or 51. And the real wages and real payroll are growing in Brazil. So it's one of the reasons why there's this improvement in social equality. The real wages, the blue line, is increased in real terms, so the wages are increasing in real terms, and the red line is the real increases in payroll. Payroll in Brazil means also the formality of the job market. I mean, because there are a lot of people that are employed in an informal basis, which is not good in terms of providing for the security in the job and the other access to other benefits of Social Security, for instance. With the increase in the payroll, means that more people are working in a formal market. Also here to show the unemployment rate in Brazil has come down at record levels. Used to be almost 12, 13% in January 03. Today is it's between 5 and 6%. So we are also happy to see that we have halved the number of people living on less than $1 a day in Brazil. And also we have attained a 2/3 reduction in child mortality. So Brazil has achieved the first and fourth of the UN Development Goals. This is the graphic about child mortality as it's coming down. And the life expectancy at birth is also improving. So Brazilians used to live on average 41 years old in 1914. Today is 70 years old. Still lower than Canada, I'm sure. But it's a major progress. So as a result, Brazil has succeeded in lifting more than 30 million people out of poverty over the past decade. This in turn has boosted domestic consumption and constituted one of the reasons of the high rates of economic growth in the last decade. But in order to continue to develop, Brazil will have to face many challenges, especially in developing its infrastructure. Many years of fiscal constraints have led to underinvestment in a network of ports, airports, roads, energy grid, etc. Under the Lula government, private and public investments were garnered under the Growth Acceleration Program, known as PAC. The PAC comprises investments in housing, energy, water and sanitation, urban development, transports. In the next 4 years, the program is expected to involve investments over $500 billion. Oh, here still we have the graphic on school age and the poverty reduction. Well, I don't know what happened to that. Oh, it's here. It's here. I suddenly thought that poverty has disappeared from Brazil. This is the Growth Acceleration Program. You have the main features of the program and the amount of investment expected to take place. So investment plans to modernize the country's infrastructure have also gained a further boost by the fact that the country will host major sports events, such as the 2014 FIFA World Cup and the Olympics in 2016. Investments in the construction and refurbishment of soccer stadiums shall require resources to the amount of more than $11 billion, and on related infrastructure, some $50 billion. I think you have here these figures. For the 2016 Olympics, works will require investments to the tune of almost $16 billion. And for that, I mean, many Canadian companies have shown interest in participating in these investments. Another challenge that the government faces is the challenge to simplify and render less onerous the tax system, which is key to stimulate economic growth and improve the competitiveness of the Brazilian exports. The issue has galvanized the discussions in Congress and with state governors. Also high on the economic agenda in Congress is the bill on the distribution of royalties resulting from the offshore oil and gas exploitation. The bill pits producing coastal states against consuming ones, as the producing states refuse to let the consuming states share in the royalties obtained by the oil exploitation. These bills will put to the test the resilience of the governmental coalition against the allegiances of the regional and state constituencies. On trade balance, or on foreign trade, Brazil showed in 2011 a record of $480 billion of two-way trade. And this trade accounts for around 20% of the GDP. Exports totaled 256 billion and imports 224 billion. And this year, 2012, however, data show that such performance will not be repeated in view of the decrease in the export commodity prices and the economic slowdown of major markets. Brazil's foreign trade is diversified, and the top trading partners take only 55% of our total trade. China has become Brazil's main trading partner with 16% of the two-way trade, followed by the United States with 12%. With Canada, our bilateral trade accounts for 1.5%. The primary products constitute 50% of Brazil's exports. Iron ore, oil, and sugar alone account for a third of our exports. This graphic shows that commodities are in the blue, semi-manufacturers are in red, and manufacturers are in green. So we see an increase as of 2006, 2007 of the commodities as a major export item in the Brazilian trade balances, and a slight decrease in the exports of manufacturers. And our trade relations with Canada, we are aware, there's a great potential to grow. In 2011, the two-way trade reached some $6.7 billion, with a surplus of some $400 million in favor of Canada, as per Brazilian sources. Canadian sources show a different number. Brazil's exports to Canada amounted to $3.15 billion, while imports reached $3.4 billion. The main Brazilian exports to Canada are aluminum oxides, crude oil, and raw sugar, covering approximately 60% of the total. Potassium fertilizers, coal, and newsprints are responsible for roughly 60% of the imports from Canada. The success of Brazil's prospects for growth can be credited to the maintenance of the three economic fundamentals: inflation targeting, primary fiscal surplus, and flexible exchange rate. As a result, the country has attracted foreign direct investments, which reached nearly $67 billion in 2011, and is well on course to attain $60 billion this year. In 2010, Brazil's GDP grew by 7.5% and fell to 2.7% in the following year. Today, we estimate that growth will not surpass 2%. GDP per capita stands around $13,000. The unemployment rate between 5% and 6% is a historical low, as I said, and I also showed how real average wages have attained their highest level since 2002. So here I can show you some slides that summarize the economic growth expected for Brazil. besides these, what I have just mentioned, I also could cite here the monetary and financial stimuli that are already in place. These also shall provide the necessary impetus to the acceleration of growth. Interest rates and spreads are decreasing, and reserve requirements on the banks have been reduced. On the side of the government, fiscal stimuli are also being promoted. At the end of 2012 and beginning of 2013, Brazil will be growing 4%. This is our estimation. So what is the outlook for Brazil? The government believes that all factors are in place to ensure a sustainable GDP growth over the coming years. The social policies will continue to provide gains and expand the middle class. Brazil has still a bonus, a demographic bonus, that will last until 2025. By that we mean that the majority of the Brazilian population will be active until that year and not put pressure on the social security system. Major investment opportunities exist. Expanding and upgrading infrastructure, I mentioned some of them here. Brazil still has vast reserves of mineral commodities. Offshore oil fields has a potential to expand cultivated area and agricultural production. Brazil has a reservoir of almost 30% of fresh water in the world. And major international sports events will happen in the country that also constitute an important impetus to the economy. And the government is working with the Congress and with state authorities to reach an agreement about fiscal and tax reforms and eliminate distortions that exist in our tax system. These reforms will be expected will boost investments and increase competitiveness. So what are the challenges that Brazil will face in the future? Challenges are basically these ones: increased productivity. And for that, it will have to invest a lot in human capital, on education. Government is doing part of this job with programs that are geared to expand the opportunities for education and at all levels, and at a higher level has initiated an important program called Brazil Science Without Borders that involve giving scholarships to around 100,000 Brazilian students over the next 3 to 4 years, and Canada will be an important partner in this program. Canada already decided to receive around 12,000 Brazilian students in this period. Also, an important challenge it will be to reduce what we call cost of doing business in Brazil. This will involve improving infrastructure and logistics, reducing tax burden, improving the business environment by reducing red tape and bureaucracy, keeping a competitive exchange rate, and reducing real interest rates for business. That will imply reforms, tax reforms, labor reforms, and other regulations. In an important role expected from the Congress on this in helping passing the necessary legislation. So here you have, again, a summary of what fiscal and tax reforms are expected to take place in Brazil. These reforms are necessary to improve basically the competitiveness of the economy. Some measures have been taken, one of the, such as allowing private sector in some infrastructure concessions like airports. 4 of them have already been auctioned in São Paulo and Campinas, in Brazilië and Natal. And new concessions will be given to construct highways, ports, railways, and airports, construct and manage these activities. Also, reforms will try to improve the skills of the labor force and the program Science Without Borders, as I mentioned, and also an important program at the level of professional and technological education. Government wants to expand the number of trainees in this level of education, 8 million trainees over the next 4 years. Here is in this graphic, it just to show the growing of the middle class in Brazil is an important element of social stability and economic growth. As you can see, the middle class in Brazil is in blue. In 2003, was 66% of the population. No, 66 million, sorry, 66 million of the population. In 2011, reached 105, and should reach in 2014 118 million people. The rich people are also increasing in numbers in Brazil, so it's not at the expense of them, but the middle class are growing at the expense of the poor. So the poor are having their levels reduced in favor of the expansion of the middle class. And the demographic bonus that I've referred to is shown in this pyramid of the population. So you see the large portion of the population located between the ages of 14 and 50 years old in Brazil. So they are considered to be the active segment of the population. Now I'll turn to speak briefly, maybe not so briefly, about the foreign policy of Brazil. Since the early days, Brazil as an independent country, its foreign policy has been designed to help consolidate the country's borders, which were done by means of bilateral treaties and international arbitration, to foster political and economic cooperation with neighboring countries, to strengthen international cooperation, to uphold the primacy of international law and the role of multilateral organizations, to promote respect of human rights, to promote disarmament and peaceful settlement of disputes, to support North-South as well as South-South cooperation. In this context, Brazil fought alongside democratic forces against imperialism and Nazi fascism aggressions in the First and Second World Wars. It is a founding member of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT, WTO, the ILO, and many other multilateral institutions. It also helped create the Group of 77 of developing countries. In the hemisphere, is a founding member of the Organization of American States and a party to the Inter-American Treaty of Mutual Assistance. In the Latin American region, Brazil has actively promoted cooperation. It helped create the Latin American Integration Association, and together with Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, founded in 1991 the Mercosur, a customs union. In the last decade, it encouraged the formation of UNASUR, the Union of the South American Nations, as a means to foster regional development, integration, and political cooperation. Also, it has helped establish the Latin America and Caribbean community only last year. As announced in her inaugural speech, President Dilma Rousseff's government is implementing a foreign policy that has its main features I would say, priority to South American and Latin American integration, South-South cooperation, solidarity with other developing countries, in particular of Africa and the Middle East and Portuguese-speaking ones, strengthening relations with emerging countries and new groupings like IBSA and BRICS, as well as with the United States and the European Union in the context of a reinvigorated multipolar world. Brazil is also willing to strengthen ties with all countries, in particular with developed ones like Canada, as they can represent important and diversified sources of trade, investment, and technology. In the light of the conflicts occurring in the Middle East and North Africa, the President has reaffirmed that full respect of human rights, alongside other relevant principles of international law, will feature high in Brazil's foreign policy. Brazil continues to vigorously support a reform of international governance as to allow for increased participation of emerging countries in the main decision-making bodies like the United Nations Security Council, the IMF, and the World Bank. Brazil believes that it can make a relevant contribution to the solution of the conflicts affecting many parts of the world. It is ready to make available its diplomatic and technical skills whenever it is felt that they can bring cooperation and a positive perspective to the countries in conflict. The diplomatic efforts to pursue enhanced integration of South America are also anchored on concrete projects in infrastructure, in particular in such areas as energy, communications, transport, and logistics, as well as on expanded economic and trade ties. The integration projects are expected to tap the economic potential of the new areas for development in the country's hinterland and along the borders. In general terms, the profile of the Brazilian foreign policy has risen to the point that the country can be considered today a soft power. That is, it has the ability to influence outcomes in other countries. This can be attributed to some factors, which I'll try to explain. One of these factors has to do with the fact that Brazil has shown increased ability to help shape the outcome of major negotiations or to influence their direction, such as those taking place at the WTO, the UN system, the G20, among others. Also, by fostering the setting up of inter- and intra-regional mechanisms, the country is opening new avenues to augment its presence where it was barely felt a few decades ago. Soft power is a product, first, of the rise in Brazil's economic standing. Today, it is the sixth largest world economy. It is a major producer and exporter of various agricultural and mineral commodities. It has a rather diversified economy and industrial base and is becoming a major energy producer. These economic assets have drawn the attention of the world business centers and made Brazil the second largest recipient of foreign direct investment after China. In 2011, as I said, Brazil received around $67 billion of foreign investments. Second, the country has achieved success in addressing its intractable problems of income inequality, poor social indicators, and political instability. The progress made in these sensitive areas has enhanced Brazil's international profile, and as a consequence, it has improved its world political standing and its prospects for sustained economic growth. Third, Brazil's influence can also be attributed to its capacity to articulate positions in various international negotiations that affect their outcome. For instance, in the WTO Doha round, Brazil's leadership was key to create a third force in the negotiations on agriculture. It has also helped strengthen the hand of the developing countries in withstanding the pressures against unbalanced results in many other sectors under negotiation, such as tariffs and services. Likewise, on environment, Brazil has been a key player in fashioning the outcomes of the negotiations on climate change. See, for instance, its role in concocting a group of emerging countries, the BASIC, to fight for a balanced result at the Copenhagen Conference in 2009. It has also been instrumental in the drafting of a consensus document on sustainable development adopted at the Rio+20 conference. The event was attended by governmental and non-governmental delegations, which totaled some 45,000 people. It has been considered a milestone as it brought together for the first time governments, civil society, and private sector in discussions to achieve the summit's main objective, namely a plan that commits all with the eradication of poverty as an imperative element of sustainable development, as well as with having all main stakeholders to take fully into account sustainable development in their decision-making processes. So what can one expect of Brazil's foreign policy in the future? Brazil is a multilateralist, as it believes that only through the strengthening of the multilateral institutions it would be able to better advance its interests. That is why it has been a key player in negotiations to set international rules on environment, trade, law of the sea, disarmament, human rights, among others. In addition, it is persuaded that multilateral efforts can more adequately ensure international peace and security, as well as provide legitimacy and efficacy to conflict resolution, as it is co-validated by the international community. Brazil's positions in international forums in general seek to combine the preservation of the norms and institutions with a revision of some of their futures. But such stance, by and large, aims at better reflecting the interests of new important actors in the field that is the object of the forum in question. In the reform of the Security Council, for instance, where Brazil has grouped with Germany, Japan, and India, it advocates the maintenance of the present norms that rule that body. It does not question the veto power held by the so-called P5, much less their permanency in the Security Council. The change that Brazil seeks is to introduce new permanent members without veto power until a review conference is convened to examine the implementation of the reform. Such change will be necessary to make the Security Council more representative and its decisions more legitimate and efficient, as they would reflect views of a wider and geographically more diversified spectrum of the international community. In the case of the IMF governance, Brazil proposes to change the allocation of quotas and better reflect the contemporary economic realities with the coming into play of the emerging markets. It does not desire to alter the operations of the fund. At the WTO, Brazil is at the forefront of the negotiations to introduce norms that bring world agricultural trade fully under the provisions of trade liberalization, which are at the core of that organization. It also supports adjustments in the rules governing trade in order to take care of the less favored situation of the developing countries. In other institutions of universal membership, like those I have mentioned, Brazil has in general taken positions that, while not tinkering with their governing rules, provide more space for the introduction of themes and approaches that cater to its interests and to those of the developing countries. Where it has arguably made bolder movements is in the context of South-South and regional cooperation. Brazil has championed, for instance, the strengthening of intra- and inter-regional ties in the developing world. This is not mere rhetoric. The country has taken concrete steps to foster closer economic and political relations with South American countries in the UNASUR and Latin American and Caribbean ones in CELAC, as well as between South America and Africa and Arab countries, respectively, by means of specific summits. It has also developed a more aggressive diplomacy by generating new regional arrangements like the IBSA with India and South Africa, and the BRICS and the BASICs. Likewise, through the expansion of its diplomatic missions in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, it has made a determined option to be a player in areas of the planet where previously had been a distant partner at best. In all these new forums, Brazil has made a point to underpin its participation by the principles of respect to international law, human rights, democracy, solidarity, peaceful settlement of disputes. To sum up, I think that Brazil, emboldened by a growing economy and a more cohesive population, has been seeking to make its voice heard in all global and regional forums, not only to render them more responsive to its national interests, but also to open such institutions to new actors from the developing world. And I think I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you. So now I'm available for any questions that you'd like to put to me.
School of International Affairs. You mentioned in passing twice the BRICS countries. A few years ago, there was a great deal of excitement about the possibility that the BRICS countries could form a very effective additional tier, block, or grouping, at least for promoting a cooperative global international agenda. In recent months, however, and perhaps the last year or so, we haven't heard so much about the BRICS. And so I'm wondering what your views are from a Brazilian perspective about the strengths and weaknesses of the BRICS as a grouping, and what distinctive international role you think they might be able to play in advancing innovations in global governance.
Thank you. I think that BRICS continues to have a very active role. Perhaps it has changed a little bit its nature, in terms that at the beginning the BRICS were created in order to coordinate positions vis-à-vis some negotiations or discussions in certain forums, such as the G20. It now is evolving a little bit more in direction of cooperating among the members of the BRICS, cooperating among themselves and developing mechanisms to foster this cooperation. And one example is the possible creation of a development bank by the BRICS. This is something relatively innovative, coming from this group of countries. And strengthening the intra-cooperation of the group, we believe that also at the same time the group will become more and more important in other international discussions. But we are aware that when you're going to discuss specific subjects, the group will not necessarily have a common position on certain issues. The interests may vary according to those issues. And so our view is that the BRICS have been left outside of the main forum in discussions regarding international economic governance, international economy in general, now has made has made itself important in these negotiations or discussions, and we hope that by improving our cooperation in many fields, we can also evolve in the direction of creating an important group that could act in these international negotiations as such. So I think it will take time. It's not something that will be done overnight. We don't have the same, or don't have the capacity of articulate rapidly our views in different mechanisms. But I think the path is cemented in that direction.
Thank you for coming here, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. A little background to my question. The Brazilians that I know in Canada have said the big difference between Brazil and Canada is their feeling of safety in Canada as compared to Brazil. That's my background. The question I have is, has it been the deliberate policy of the government of Brazil to fight crime by reducing poverty, rather than increasing the number of police and building more and bigger jails?
No, I think it's both. The policy is to combine social policies of poverty reduction with reinforcement of police and improvement of prisons in Brazil. I mean, it's a commitment taken by the government with the Brazilian society. I mean, the Brazilian society certainly is tired of being subject to violence or activities by criminals in many cities of Brazil. But the problem of criminality in Brazil is not a simple matter of delinquency. It is also a result of many years of underinvestment in public services and not providing the necessary number of jobs and education to the people and improvements in the health system. So this has been now a part and parcel of governmental policies, and being taken not only at the federal level but also at state and municipal levels in Brazil, which are very important in dealing with criminality. So police in Brazil is a matter of state governments. Health and education is divided between states and municipal authorities, but the federal government has the general or the overarching approach to this to deal with these issues. So, in a nutshell, I mean, in response to your question, the approach is a comprehensive approach to the reduction of criminality.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for coming and talking with us and giving us such an informative talk. I'm Catherine Hostetler, a professor here at the Balsillie School and at the University of Waterloo, and would have had lunch with you if your plane had been on time. So I'm pleased to have the chance to meet you tonight. I'd like to return to the question of foreign policy and ask you about what's probably one of the most unexpected turns of recent foreign policy under President Rousseff, which is the sudden addition of Venezuela as a full member to Mercosur, which obviously we've been expecting for some time, but I at least didn't expect to see it come quite as quickly as it did when it did. So if you could talk about that recent episode, I'd be very appreciative.
Thank you. The incorporation of Venezuela to Mercosur has been a long-standing objective of Brazilian foreign policy. And we could not achieve that because the Senate in Paraguay never ratified the agreement for the incorporation of Venezuela. And we always failed to realize why Paraguay had such an adamant position in refusing the entrance of Venezuela into Mercosur, because the other three wanted Venezuela in: Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. So Venezuela was the agreement to have Venezuela in the Mercosur was signed in 2006, around that year. And since then, Venezuela could never come into Mercosur because the Senate Paraguay refused to accept it. With the situation in Paraguay where in our view, the democratic system has been suspended in Paraguay, we thought that, and as a consequence, Paraguay was suspended from the Mercosur because it infringed a democratic clause of Mercosur. We thought that we had the conditions there to admit Venezuela in the grouping. So we think Venezuela could be a tremendous asset for Mercosur. Is a country, one of the major oil producers in the world. It has a strong market, and Mercosur is basically a customs union, so it's basically an economic and a trade arrangement. So we think that Venezuela can bring to the regional integration a positive contribution. And we hope that the Paraguay, when it comes back to Mercosur, because the suspension is in place until the next elections in Paraguay, which will be in April next year, we hope that then Paraguay will be more forthcoming and can be more reasonable and accept Venezuela in the Union. What we cannot guarantee is the position of Paraguay itself. I mean, Paraguay can continue to refuse, and then we will have to try to find a solution for that. And that, I hope that Brazil's diplomatic skills can prevail.
Thank you.
I have a question here on the internet. The question is, as an emerging world power, how is the Brazilian government promoting environmental protection? Signed by Ali from Waterloo. Well, environmental protection in Brazil is a very, very sensitive issue. The Brazilian society is very much committed to guarantee environmental protection in Brazil, preservation of environment for future generations. And we have a Minister of Environment too that is involved in promoting mechanisms that ensure the protection of environment. It's a constant negotiation with the society and with the business community, because obviously what affects most the environment in Brazil is the expansion of the economy with the incorporation of new areas for agriculture, for instance. But this discussion is taking place, and the Ministry of Environment and the regulations that are in place will try to make sure that whatever expansion in the use of land for economic purposes achieve a balance between the interests of the society, balances in terms of preservation of the environment and providing the means for jobs and the production of wealth for the benefit of the poor segments of the population. Yes?
Hello, thank you for your presentation. That was very informative. My question is about the Brazil economy. So my understanding of the Brazilian economy is that it's very much resource oriented, in that the biggest sectors in the economies are natural resources such as mining, energy, those sectors. And in your presentation, you also mentioned that there will be significant investment in infrastructure. But my question here is, does Brazil see itself as a kind of natural resource exporter in the future, or does it have a plan to become, to have more industry, to have more value-added services and manufacturing industries? Thank you.
Thank you. I think all of this that you've said, I mean, it intends to continue to be a major producer of commodities, either minerals or agricultural commodities, and to increase the production as if the economic conditions are set for that, and improve the infrastructure to make this production more efficient, more productive, and less costly, but at the same time to improve the technological content of the Brazilian manufacturers by means of attracting investments in Brazilian industry, improving our capacity to absorb the new technologies by having research centers, technological centers, and improving the educational skills of the Brazilian people. And this is a clear goal of this government. Thank you.
In 2014, Brazil will host the Soccer World Cup. Will the internationally recognized greatest soccer player in history, Pelé, be recognized properly for what he has done for the game? Thank you.
Do I need to answer that? Certainly is. Pelé is a non-controversial personality in Brazil, and I think in many parts of the world too. So the contribution he has made to make Brazil known around the world is invaluable. I mean, and he's still active, although he's more than 70 or around 70 years old now, Pelé, but still very active, still promoting. He's our ambassador for the World Cup. So he's traveling around promoting the World Cup, and I'm sure that you'll be there to welcome all the national teams that will participate in that event. Okay.
He's 72 now. He's 74.
Oh yeah, so you know better. There's a question there.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for your presentation and an excellent overview, and I'm wondering if it will be available, the slides and so on, in any format, internet?
I can make available to CIGI, perhaps, yeah.
Okay. I've been going to Brazil for well over 21 years with an NGO managing projects, and I have seen some of the improvements, and I was there for the collar ruckus a few years ago, so I sympathize with what you were talking about. My question relates to the economy, and you had talked about the interest rate, or you hadn't talked too much about the interest rate, but the inflation rate. I think it was 5.4% or something. The interest rate is relatively high, and I think the inflation rate, I'm just finding it hard to believe that it's 5.4%, because from going down there every year, things seem to be going up fairly rapidly in price. And I'm just wondering the relationship between the interest rate and the unemployment rate.
Yeah. The 5.4 is the annual rate of inflation for this year. It's forecasted around that. Last year was 6.5, so it's coming down this year to 5.4, about that. The interest rates, or the Selic interest rates, the rates charged by the central bank to banks, is around 7.25 today. So the real interest rates then will be about little over 2% a year. So it has become smaller compared to the rates charged in the past, where there was a year in Brazil that the interest rate, the Selic interest rate was as high as 22% more than that. So now it's come down. And why it has come down while the inflation rate stays more or less the same or with some variation up and downwards? Is because the central bank, as I think this is the practice of the central banks in general. It takes care not only of using monetary policies, not only to control the rate of the inflation, but also to control the growth of the economy and the provision of jobs for the people. So what the central bank in Brazil has done lately is that the conditions for a more or less stable evolution of the prices of the goods transacted in the economy allowed some space for the central bank to promote some an easing of the conditions for the business operators to grow, to do business, to hire more people as a consequence of that. So that's what happened in Brazil over the past year. The interest rates had come down gradually from almost 9% 1 year ago to now 7.25. But I think it will stay there. We don't see signs that will allow for further reduction in interest rates in the short term. I think it will stay at this, or at least has reached the lowest level. And given the level of the inflation rate, so it will stay around that figure. But as the positive aspect of that, that it has helped in hiring more people and providing more jobs in Brazil, as I could show in the graphic. It's one of the reasons why the unemployment rate in Brazil is very low now. Thank you. Okay.
Ambassador Tarragô, thank you so much. You've shown us explained to us not only why Brazil is the world power that it is, but I think you've demonstrated quite convincingly that Brazil is offering a great deal to global governance. And thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Tarragô. I do have a few administrative announcements. I would like to once again thank the organizers of the Ambassador Series, the University of Waterloo, and the co-sponsors, the Balsley School and CIGI. I would also like to thank our web audience for tuning in. We appreciate that a great deal. Next week, there are 2 events going on here on October 24th and 25th, and I'm sure you saw the banners in the foyer for the Armageddon Letters Project, which is to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the 24th, there will be an art exhibit and a book launch here from 7 till 9. And then the following evening, there will be a public lecture, and we invite you all to come to one or both of those events. So thank you once again for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
View of its political evolution. Brazil became independent from Portugal in 1822. In early 1800s, on account of Napoleonic wars in Europe, the King of Portugal fled to Brazil and set out to govern the kingdom from Rio de Janeiro. After the demise of Napoleon, the Portuguese king returned to Lisbon in 1816. However, he left behind his son, Prince Pedro, to run the vice-kingdom of Brazil. In 1822, the prince, rebelling against the reimposition of draconian colonial rules by Lisbon, declared the independence of Brazil and was crowned king. So Brazil became a monarchy for almost 70 years, up to 1889, when the Republic was installed after a military coup. The economic formation of the country derives essentially from the exploration of its natural resources and immigration, immigration voluntary or not. In the 1800s, immigration to Brazil grew exponentially. It came mainly from Africa, slaves, but also from Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy. New lands were opened for agricultural production. Coffee and sugar were the principal export items then, and the coffee plantations that spread around São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro produced the wealth necessary to establish the first industrial
from 2003 to 2005, and in the TRIPS negotiations in the Uruguay round. He was spokesperson for the producing countries at the International Coffee Organization and was also Brazilian delegate to many negotiations at the United Nations, including those at the General Assembly, those involving Security Council reform, the establishment of the Peace-Building Commission, UNCTAD, the Group of 77, South-South Cooperation, as well as the GATT and the WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. Please help me in welcoming Ambassador Tarragô.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event, CIGI, the Brazilian School of International Affairs. Thanks also to Dr. Thompson for the words of introduction he pronounced to me in my regard. And also say that I'm very happy to be here in Waterloo. I've been very well received by Waterloo, and I'm on going back to Ottawa. I'm going to tell my French colleague that he could come here without any problem. What I'll present to you today is an overview about Brazil, and you'll see from the overview what Brazil is.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the CIGI campus. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science and the program officer for the global governance programs, which are based here at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Tonight is the inaugural event in this year's 2012-2013 Ambassadors Lecture Series, which is organized by the University of Waterloo and co-sponsored by the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Balsley School of International Affairs, which is a three-way partnership between CIGI, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Waterloo. And this year's theme for the series is the BRIC countries. This evening's topic is Brazil and its prospects for the future, presented by His Excellency, Mr. Piragibe dos Santos Tarragô, Ambassador of Brazil to Canada. And I think it's fair to say that Brazil is a major player on the world stage. In recent years, Brazil has made incredible contributions to the United Nations system. One example, since 2004, Brazil, along with a number of Latin American countries, has been leading the rebuilding effort in Haiti, which is no easy task, including providing much-needed security to the tiny Caribbean country. Brazil has also become a leader in the global economy and on issues of global development. One of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Hochstetter, who's a specialist on Brazil, has noted that, and I quote her, "The trajectory is clearly in the direction of..."
Has been doing and what direction is taking. And you can certainly assess what are the possibilities of Brazil in the future. This presentation intends to provide my personal views about Brazil prospects for the coming years. I have tried to make my views as objective as possible, based on facts and data, especially as regards the economic and social fields. I have also made use of information contained in government papers, as they reflect policies whose implementation will influence the direction the country will take in the years to come. And I have taken in my consideration 4 elements, namely the political, the economic, social, and foreign policy elements. To start with, I will just give you a data about Brazil, and that you could peruse as I speak, and you'll see the main elements that constitute today Brazil as a big country, I mean territorial and population and GDP, the natural resources it has, and the democracy that is following politically, and is a very good neighbor with our friends in Latin America. It is the 6th largest economy today in the world, and the 5th largest area, and the 5th largest population. But to understand the Brazil of today, I think I should give you a brief.
Brazil being an increasingly important contributor to the global common goods. And as I'm sure you all know, Brazil will be hosting the 2014 World Cup of Soccer and the 2016 Summer Olympic Games, and we anticipate both of those events with great eagerness. Finally, many of you may have seen this in the Globe and Mail this morning or heard it on CBC radio, but Brazil has just today strengthened its ties with Canada. And it was reported that a Brazilian company, JBS South America, is now in fact taking over the management of the now infamous XL Foods processing plant in Alberta. Today we are very lucky to have Ambassador Tarragô join us today. Following his talk, there will be a short question and answer period. There are microphones in each aisle, and I invite you to come up and ask questions, and please introduce yourself when you do ask your question. I will now share with you the ambassador's bio, which is absolutely incredible. His Excellency has been ambassador of Brazil to Canada since February 2011. He's a career diplomat since 1975, and he has had postings that include Maputo, the United Nations, Ottawa, Geneva, Caracas, and London. At the Ministry of External Affairs in Brazil, he headed the Trade on High Technology Goods Division and Trade Policy Division and the Department of Economic Affairs. He has also served as Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. He has worked mostly in economic matters in his functions in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was the main negotiator for Brazil in the very important NAMA negotiations in the Doha round.